seconds. Thank
Cool.
you. Sorry about that.
Can I ask a question in the end?
Yeah, sure.
Is there, in your arena of study, are there data on whether there's a correlation between what people within a congressional district poll at and who they vote for?
Sort of. I'll show you in a second. Not at that. I wish I had the data at that resolution. I don't. But I'll show you some national data that maybe speak to that in a second. Okay, so remember I said there's a growing gap between moderate Republicans and right Republicans on climate. There's also a growing gap between old Republicans and young Republicans on climate. So this is a bunch of different questions about, government is doing too little too, a bunch of environmental issues, favor expanding each energy source more. Some of the top ones are solar and wind. And you can see that the blue dots, the young Republicans, look more like Democrats than the green dots, which are the older Republicans. Okay, so there's growing majorities nationally, but even growing constituencies within the Republican Party that want more done. So my message to Republicans is, if you don't take this issue seriously, you're going to lose. And this is something that we're looking at directly right now. This is data from this project called the Voter Study Group, where you can get individual level data on different issues and voting behaviors. And this is just independents and how important do they rate climate change? So left is more important than right. And who do they vote for, Biden or Trump? And you can see there's a really strong correlation. And sure, climate opinion correlates with other things like how liberal you are, but you throw all these things in a regression, you cannot make the climate effect go away, especially for independents. And the other thing is the fraction of independents that think climate change is important is going up. So we're trying to estimate exactly what the cost is, but there's some non-trivial percentage cost, all else equal, in vote for the Republican Party nationally from the climate change issue. That is, it will probably only grow until the point where the public sees their approach as equally serious about the issue as the Democratic Party. In our 2/3 majority platform, there's lots of climate policies. You can tax corporate emissions. You can do tax credits for carbon capture and storage and tree planting, although be careful where you do it because sometimes the trees burn down and then there's no carbon. You can do renewable portfolio standards, so basically mandating renewable electricity by a certain amount of time. You can do net metering, so allowing people who make more solar than they need to sell it back to the grid. You can increase fuel efficiency standards for cars. You can restrict power plant emissions, and you can increase solar and wind production. And by the way, as I'll show you in a second, there are bipartisan groups at the state level that are doing all of, if not most of those things already. Again, as I said, there are still special interests and apathy as barriers. So I talked about special interests a second ago, and these are 2 books about that. Apathy, if you ask people, should we take climate change seriously? Should we do more? Most people say yes. If you ask people, what's your single most important issue? Even most Democrats don't say yes currently, right? They might say the economy, they might say crime, they might say what you might think of as more sort of present kitchen table issues. Okay, so same Renee Marshall. We looked at all of the state level decarbonization bills passed from 2015 to 2020. And I say decarbonization bills because we didn't include bills that were designed to roll climate policies back or do something that was not beneficial to decarbonization. And not surprisingly, we found that the Democrats disproportionately passed them. What you see on the x-axis is who controlled the state government, and on the y-axis is the co-sponsorship. A couple things I want to draw your attention to: about 1/3 of the bills were bipartisan in terms of their co-sponsorship. Those are all the pink ones. A non-trivial minority were passed by Republicans sponsors in Republican states. And about 30% were passed in governments that either had a Republican majority, which we defined as basically 2 of the 3, upper house, lower house, and governor, were controlled by the Republicans, or Republican trifecta, meaning they all were controlled by Republicans. The other thing that's really interesting in these data is that, and that's shown on the right here, bills that were sponsored by Republicans or were bipartisan pretty much passed unanimously. Bills that were sponsored only by Democrats, some passed unanimously and some passed along party lines. That's sort of the two peaks. And so basically Democrats vote for everybody's climate policies and Republicans sometimes only vote for their own. So again, my message to Republicans is, if you don't do anything, you're going to lose. If you do something, you actually have a lot of bargaining power because the Democrats are often going to vote for what you do. But you got to do something. What are the correlates of bills that are bipartisan? This graph's a little bit hard to read, but basically bills were more disproportionately bipartisan if they expanded choice, which you think of as carrots as opposed to sticks. They, instead of banning something, they incentivize something, for example. Ones that use financial incentives, and ones that framed environmental justice elements in terms of class or economics and not in terms of immutable characteristics. Some examples of bipartisan or bills that were passed in red states: Arkansas's Solar Access Act of 2019, Georgia's Solar Power Free Market Financing Act of 2015, South Carolina's Energy Freedom Act. And again, there's dozens of others. All three of those had an element of net metering, I believe, and the South Carolina one also had an element of voluntary emission standards for utilities, if I'm remembering right. There have also been some federal developments. It's true the IRA was not bipartisan, but bipartisan solution caucuses were formed in the House and the Senate. Representative John Curtis, who's a congressman from Utah, started the Conservative Climate Caucus in the House in 2021, and now it's one of the largest Republican caucuses in the House. And he was inspired to do that by talking to young constituents of his who were young Republicans who wanted to more done on climate change. And those young Republicans have a group called the American Conservation Coalition. There was climate spending in the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure and COVID relief bills. And of course, the CHIPS and Science Act, which has a lot of climate elements, was also bipartisan. And I think the IRA will withstand the test of time because even though it wasn't bipartisan, it included a lot of the elements that we identified as bipartisan at the state level. My student, Renee, and I wrote an op-ed that was originally titled Democrats Came to the Center on Climate, Republicans Should Join Them. And the New York Times didn't publish it, so we published it after it passed under a different name. Okay, another reason why there's incentives to come together on climate for Republicans is that there's a lot of money in it for their districts, right? So this is looking at which districts are going to benefit the most from IRA spending. And you can see that there's a lot of red ones, right? In fact, the district, who do you think represents the district in the country with the second most planned and operational renewable capacity? Yes, who said? Somebody over here. Kevin McCarthy, that's right. The big red one in California. Okay, so another study we did was looking at, by the way, Renee Marshall was an undergrad when she was in my lab. She was incredibly brilliant. She's now a PhD student at UC Santa Barbara. So we did a study. One of the other things that's common in climate policy is people want to pair climate policies with other things, right? So sometimes there's groups that want to pair climate policies with pausing or reducing regulation, like the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. Where the idea is that's how we're gonna bring Republicans along. There's folks like the Sunrise Movement that want to pair different environmental justice policies with climate to address multiple priorities. There's people who pair with infrastructure, etc. And so we wanted to look at how do voters respond to that pairing. So we had a large nationally representative sample, and we basically had them evaluate their support for either climate policies alone or the same climate policies paired with one of either pausing EPA regulations, tech and infrastructure spending, what we called economic progressivism, to things like tax on the rich, basic income program, unionized clean energy jobs, or we called social justice or social justice indicators. And these were bills that either had an aspect that was explicitly not neutral with respect to an immutable characteristic, or it included jargon that sounded like it came from the sociology department. So words like marginalized, equity, etc. And why do we separate those two out? Again, because the median voter is an economic liberal and social conservative, we thought that voters might respond differently to social justice and economic justice policies. Okay, if you're a policy bundler, the bad news is nothing works. Okay, we didn't find any policies that increased, any bundles that increased the support for climate policy. The one asterisk there is that in our study, you can see economic redistribution, the purple one, is about the same as alone for independents and Republicans and slightly higher for Democrats. And so potentially slightly higher overall. In our study, that effect was not statistically significant. There was another study by Leah Stokes and Madame Bilderberger's group that just looked at economic progressive policies and did find a significant positive effect of a similar nature. So positive effect for Democrats, neutral effect for everyone else. So maybe that one works. But the two that are often talked about do not. So if you pair with pausing regulation, you lose independents and Democrats. If you pair with social justice, you actually lose independents the most, especially men and especially people who are ideologically conservative. There's a really interesting difference between Republican, Democrat, and conservative liberal in this measure, which is something that I don't yet completely understand, but I'm trying to understand. And this echoes another experiment. There was this is an experiment by Micah English and Joshua Kalla, who looked at, for the exact same policy, either a racial frame or a class frame, and found that the class frame was always as or more popular, including in the case of climate policy. So hopefully I've made the case that, a big tent approach to climate that's going to get a lot of popularity, focuses on carrots over sticks, and focuses on class and kitchen table issues rather than identity. Now, a really important point on the second one is that you can still, first of all, there are very real identity-based injustices related to climate and environment, right? So if you look at pollution, I believe race is a better predictor of pollution exposure than class is. Some of that has to do with rural areas being very white, but probably not all of it. So this doesn't mean you can't address those issues, right? The focusing on saying, we're going to clean up areas that are disproportionately polluted. There's nothing identitarian about that, right? Well, where are areas disproportionately polluted? Where are you going to end up cleaning up, right? Same thing. We're going to focus on areas that have high poverty. Again, that's neutral, framed as a kitchen table issue, but has a correlation in who it targets and therefore also in its impact. Okay, the last two points that I mentioned in my abstract, which I'm going to argue now, are that you want optimism over pessimism and plain-spoken discourse over hyperbole and histrionics. For those who don't know the word histrionics, it's basically performative melodrama. That's not, I don't think that's quite how Webster defines it, but that's the intuitive way to understand it. Okay, so why optimism over pessimism? Here's the short answer. Pessimism can be motivating. So the studies that look at, which is more effective in motivating people, pessimism or optimism, the literature is actually more mixed than I personally would like it to be, right? With my optimistic disposition. But I think there are two really important caveats. One is that pessimism tends to be more motivating for angry, destructive things and less motivating for building stuff, right? So people are, now protesting is not always bad, but pessimism is more likely to motivate someone to protest than say to, build bridges, for example. The other thing is fatalism is not, right? So if you tell your kids, we got 8 years left, right? We're going to spend 7 of them getting federal permits. So we're doomed, right? And they're not going to want to do anything, right? It's just going to make them depressed. Young people being depressed is a huge problem in our society, okay? And I would argue that we in higher ed are making it worse. I'll show a slide on this in a second. Optimism is unifying, pessimism is divisive, right? We'll talk about this more in a few slides, but the narrative that, America is this horribly backwards country, we've never done anything right, our society is broken, but we're going to lead the world on climate change and we're going to all come together. It's like, wait, how? And also, what does that message say to the rest of the world, right? Oh, we're this horribly backwards country, but you should follow us into the climate sunset, right? Doesn't Saudi Arabia's gonna be like, why? And then lastly, and most importantly, optimism is, I would argue, more consistent with the facts than pessimism. Hannah Ritchie has a great book that just came out on this called Not the End of the World. She's the head environment researcher for the website Our World in Data. Okay, a couple of points about youth mental health crisis. So it's a crisis. The left is emergency room visits for self-inflicted injuries for teenagers. It's gone way up, especially for girls. The Guardian's reporting on a survey that said that 4 in 10 young people are afraid to have children due to climate change, and 45% in the same survey said that the climate anxiety affects their daily functioning. Okay? One of the really interesting empirical patterns that's emerged, it's always been true, but it's gotten bigger, is that the liberal and conservative gap has grown, especially among young people. So this is just one measure, but there are many measures by which conservatives are happier than liberals, at least in the United States. Varying reasons why people think that is include that conservatives tend to believe more in personal agency. They disproportionately participate in religious groups, and participation in religion is separately a correlate of happiness. And they're less likely to be concerned about these kind of big, grand problems. The psychologists call it system justification. One thing I want to point out is this survey in 2020 found that they asked the question, has a doctor or healthcare provider ever told you that you have a mental health condition? And more than half of liberal women said yes. And it's not a story of, obviously with Dobbs and everything, there's lots of things that, women are anxious about, right? But if you look at how this breaks down, it's not, it doesn't correlate the way you think with disadvantage. So for example, it's much stronger for white girls than for non-white girls. And I worry that some of the messages that we promote on campus about encouraging fatalism, encouraging black and white thinking, are contributing to that. Optimism is consistent with the facts. This is deaths from natural disasters on average, going back to the 20s. It's gone way, 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 way down. And there's a whole bunch of different ways in which the world has gotten better and safer. This is damages from natural disasters as a percentage of exposed GDP, closer to the disaster in the left, farther away on the right. It's gone down in high income and middle income groups on average, and low middle income groups on average, more so in the latter. So adaptation has progressed faster proportionally in poor countries than rich countries. That's true in a bunch of other areas. The fraction of the child mortality rate in just low-income countries has fallen by 2/3 since 1990. Okay, the world is getting better. Every time you see a climate apocalypse-like headline in the New York Times, click through to the study and see if it's based on the scenario called RCP 8.5 or SSP 5.8.5. That's the IPCC scenario that projects something like 4.5 degrees of warming by 2100. It is way off where people think we are currently headed. So current policies in action, we do nothing else besides what we're already doing, we might be a little bit more than 2.5 degrees. If we hit our pledges and targets, we're right around 2 degrees. So we're still not at 1.5, but we're if we accelerate what we're currently doing, there's still a chance to hit 2. Okay, why did I say click through the next time you see the New York Times? This is a study we did where basically the graph on the right is a slightly more complicated version of what I just showed you, that basically the current realistic trends are towards these 2 to 3 degree scenarios. On the left is how often does the IPCC report, which reviews the literature, cite the scenarios? And the answer is they overwhelmingly cite the super hot one, SSP 5.8.5. Now, I've written a bunch of papers on why, and so have other people, on why that scenario is unrealistic. The short version is you have to believe the following three things can be true at the same time. The world is so rich that the GDP per capita of sub-Saharan Africa is over $120,000 in today's dollars. So everyone's a Google employee. And we need to be that rich to demand enough energy to get that hot. We also need to be completely all in on coal. And so we turn off all the climate policy we have already. We turn off the gas, natural gas technology, and just have a coal bonanza until 2100. And again, we need that and the richness to demand enough energy to get that hot. If we really got that hot, it would be virtually impossible for humans to live in some of the hottest places in the world, who are also supposed to be rich and unconcerned about climate change. No, right? I don't need a complicated scientific argument to hopefully convince you that that's not going to happen. Optimism is, again, it's consistent with the facts. These are all a whole bunch of different ways that the world has improved. So the fraction of people in extreme poverty was basically virtually everybody 200 years ago, and now it's less than 10%. Democracy was a tiny fraction of the population 200 years ago, and now it's more than half the population. Vaccination's gone up, education's gone up, literacy's gone up, child mortality's gone way down. The world is getting better. Okay, who needs to hear that? People in rich countries. Okay, this is probably hard to read, but this basically was a survey where they asked people in the last 20 years, has the proportion of world population living in extreme poverty decreased, increased, or remained the same? There's only one right answer to that. It's decreased, right? It's not a subjective question. People who, the green is the fraction of people who got it right, red is people who said it's increased, and then yellow is people who said they don't know. And the countries where people, basically people got it wrong everywhere, but the countries where people did the best, China, Kenya, Peru, India, Senegal, where people got it the worst, countries like Italy, Japan, France, Spain, the United States is kind of in the middle towards the bottom, right? Now, I can think of at least three reasons why this pattern exists. One, which probably affects all countries, is the negativity bias in the news. Two is that economic growth tends to be faster per capita in middle-income countries than in rich countries, so maybe they see progress more, right? And you think about China, how much they've changed in the last 20 years. But I want to provocatively suggest that a third reason is privilege, right? We have the privilege to ignore progress and take it for granted and increase our status by tweeting about the coming apocalypse. So we should stop doing that because it's making our kids depressed. This is another measure of the same thing, who thinks the world's getting better? And again, China, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia all think the world's getting better. USA, Great Britain, Germany, Australia, and France don't. Okay, plain-spoken discourse over hyperbole and histrionics. People recognize when they're not being treated with respect. I can't tell you how many times I've been in workshops or conferences or meetings where people are talking about reaching across the aisle, and it's like, well, if we just use the right language to manipulate Republicans emotionally, they're going to want the Green New Deal, right? It's like, no, they're going to throw you out of their meeting. And histrionics and hyperbole erode credibility. So one of my favorite examples of this was during the IRA negotiations. There was a time where it looked like Joe Manchin wasn't going to let it pass, and John Podesta said to the New York Times, "It seems odd that Manchin would choose as his legacy to be the one man who single-handedly doomed humanity." He read a different IRA than I read, right? IRA is a good bill. I support it. But it's not the difference between humanity living or dying. And if you say stuff like that, that's not serious, and people are not going to take you seriously. But not in the ways that you want them to, right? People are engaged when you meet them where they are. And there's lots of books. Catherine Hayhoe has a good book on this. Max Boykoff, who's in my department, has a good book on this. You don't convince people by talking at them, right? You convince people by talking to them and understanding where they're coming from and what their concerns are. Catherine Hayhoe is an example of somebody who seems also Canadian, so you have to like her. She seems to be quite far left politically, but one interesting thing about her is that she's an evangelical Christian, and her husband is quite a well-known evangelical pastor, and she does really good outreach with evangelical communities because she can talk to them in their language, and she genuinely shares their values in a way that some of the rest of us might not. Okay, and then also, doomism can be dangerous. People have this idea that, well, you know, if we're too doomist, then we'll do more. Maybe we do more than we need. We'll clean the air, we'll clean the water, it'll be good, right? Whereas if we don't do enough, that's going to be dangerous. I agree that if we don't do enough, it could be dangerous. I don't agree that doomism is not dangerous. And in fact, there's lots of historical precedent. So in the 1960s, there was a book called The Population Bomb that was written by Paul and Ann Ehrlich that hypothesized that because of overpopulation and related starvation, that the UK was going to cease to exist by the year 2000. 65 million Americans would starve. It'd be a complete disaster for India. Now, obviously, they were wrong, partly because they didn't anticipate the technological change in the Green Revolution, and they didn't anticipate the declining birth rates with affluence that emerged. But it was not a costless mistake. So that book, and then the similar book, Limits to Growth by Meadows, that came out a few years later, were some of the main motivators of the one-child policy in China and several other eugenic policies, which probably caused about 100 million coerced abortions, disproportionately of girls. In Sri Lanka, a Berkeley-educated president recently said, I'm going to ban fertilizer, because fertilizer is bad for the environment, synthetic fertilizer. We're going to go organic, like that. What do you think happened? Hunger and economic crisis. I sometimes ask my students, who wants to ban coal? And some people are like, yeah. And they're like, you just turned off 60% of China's energy. Oops. Okay. We are so obsessed with dangerous ideas in college campuses, except for the literal most dangerous idea that ever existed, which is communism. Right? Communism killed almost 100 million people, much, much more than the world wars, all non-communist 20th century famines, the Holocaust, and post-World War II state-based conflicts. So the idea that, simplistic, and again, it's not, why are we so blind to this? It's because it's easier, like people who tell you that they're evil are easier to oppose in academia, right? People who, like The Great Leap Forward, one of the deadliest things that ever happened in the world, by Chairman Mao. What did he want to do? He wanted to industrialize China and catch up to Britain and fix inequality and rural poverty in his country. Who could be against that? But he had really dumb ideas for how to do that, and he enforced them in an authoritarian way, tied in with some extreme tribalism based on inequality, and ended up starving 30 to 50 million of his own people. Right? So again, we are doing our students a disservice in academia if we allow them to think, oh, it's just so simple as, if we just got rid of the fossil fuel companies, everything would be fine, right? If we just smashed the cis heteropatriarchy, we'd solve climate change, right? We have to be careful. So again, what are aspects of a Big Tent approach to climate change? Carrots over sticks, class and kitchen table issues rather than identity, optimism over pessimism, plain spoken discourse over hyperbole and histrionics, and then the last one I want to talk about is national pride over national shame. There's very strong evidence from economics and political science that investment in shared identity predicts public goods provisioning. So for example, the late economist Alberto Alesina has done a lot of work on that. Robert Putnam from Harvard has done a lot of work on that. There's many others. Common sense, this is common sense, right? We invest in shared groups, in groups that we're invested in, right? If someone says, America will never be a unified polity, we're all our little subgroups, we'll never understand each other, but do you want to raise your taxes to help people who are not in your subgroup? The answer that most people will give to that is no. So, and I say this because in climate, being patriotic in America is negatively correlated with being concerned about climate. So I suspect this is a big blind spot in the climate advocacy movement. And the message that I want to send to those on that side of the aisle is division and disunity and anti-Americanism, for the sake of climate change and also for the sake of fixing inequality, is politically self-defeating. And as elites, we may have the luxury of preening with our purity politics, but marginalized people here and around the world are going to depend on us getting something done. Okay, so some key takeaways from the talk. We need to work together to address climate change because there's no other option. There are opportunities. So there's been bipartisan federal bills. There's been some bipartisan state bills. There's lots of financial and electoral incentives to do that for both sides, including Republicans. We know what Big Tent roadmap might look like. I've given you the elements. And two things I want to leave you with. The first is that there's evidence from psychology that collaborating towards shared objectives reduces intergroup conflict. So if we can come together on climate as a nation building project, that might actually reduce the temperature of our other divisions, right? Our other divisions might seem smaller if we can come together and lead the world on climate. So to my conservative friends, I say, what could make America greater than leading the clean energy economy? That's going to come whether we do it or not. Do we want to be the leaders in that? Do we want to be exceptional Americans? I'm going to say that. I'm not even one yet. I'm working on it. I'm going to naturalize. To my liberal friends, if climate change is really an emergency, which is what liberals like to say it is, then we should be willing to work with anyone and make compromises to solve it. When you need life-saving heart surgery, you don't stop on your way to the ER and say to the doctor, hey, wait a second, what do you think about abortion? And then if they say the wrong thing, you say, nah, I'd rather die. Right? You don't do that. So why are we doing that with climate? And to everybody, I say we face a major challenge with climate change, but we live in one of the greatest societies by any measure that has ever existed. The things that are the worst about America are ubiquitous in world history pretty much in time and place, and the things that are the best about America are unique in world history pretty much in time and place. So let's act like we believe in ourselves and get it done. Thank you.
We have time for one or two questions. Wait for the mic real quick so the video can catch you.
When you had the list of possible solutions, at least to carbon, I did not see any reference to nuclear. And I'm wondering whether the Germans, now burning lignite, having shut down their nuclear facilities, what are your views on that, and is there much data on reactions to it?
Excellent question. So the things I listed were things that have been passed by bipartisan majorities and that have over 2/3 majority support. Currently, neither of those things is true about nuclear, but I think we're getting there, and I absolutely agree that from a technocratic perspective, nuclear is an extremely important solution. Partly the crisis in Ukraine has made people realize that, right? That all of a sudden energy independence is really important. The fact that Germany shut down its nuclear plants and not only isn't really decarbonizing, but has really expensive energy because the Russian gas is turned off, has changed a lot of minds, I think. And so I'm optimistic that nuclear is going there, but again, I can't, just as a matter of fact, say that it has 2/3 support or that it has passed in lots of bipartisan states because it hasn't.
One more right here.
Hello, thank you for speaking today. I had a question about, similar on the topic of energy. Is there any research on industrial innovation with voters? Because, at least in my perspective, I see there's the opportunity of where things like biofuels, sustainable aviation fuels, that just might be the new next thing, a new opportunity. But is that really tracking with people who might just think that's either greenwashing or not a viable strategy, not agree with it?
So, technology sometimes isn't popular on left Twitter, which fortunately is a very small part of the population. R&D in general is very popular among the public, and I will say it is also popular in parts of left Twitter. I haven't seen data at the level, the granularity of the specific ones you're talking about. One technocratic caveat, though, is biofuels are often not a climate solution. I apologize to everybody in the Corn Belt. But corn ethanol is not a carbon negative alternative fuel source because of you need so much land to grow the corn, and where are you going to get that land from?
All right, well, we've hit the bottom of the hour. Please join us upstairs for reception of Professor Burgess. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate being here, and a video of this will be on the law school website.